Chamber this week, we're talking video games, retro gaming, DM prep, and a little bit extra. It's not a super particular theme here on Fandom Roulette. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fandom Roulette. I am solo this week for people wondering where Joe is, and this is kind of a blanket statement. We both do this podcast around other work schedules, and unfortunately he had to work the night of this recording. So this one unfortunately is going to be a little shorter than your other stuff, but I think it should still be good. So we've been getting some questions in from the audience, and thank you guys for that. And so one of the questions that was asked for me specifically was about my gaming history. I'm the resident video game nerd here on Fandom Roulette. And one of the questions was kind of what defined my youth in video games and I guess quote-unquote retro gaming, which is kind of a weird conversation because for me, retro gaming is kind of the Super Nintendo era, which, for some people that's not retro. For some people it's, further back than that. But for me, retro gaming comes back from the Super Nintendo era. You had Earthbound, Super Mario Kart, Super Mario World. I could go on and on. And so yeah, to answer the question, it's a bit of a long-winded one. The games that kind of defined my youth, and as I get older, I have a harder time remembering the specifics of kind of my SNES days. I was but 10, 12 years old when I had my own Super Nintendo console. So the Nintendo 64, which is Nintendo's next big console, was kind of my jam and the stuff that I can remember. With the Nintendo 64, GoldenEye was kind of a staple classic, Super Mario Kart. I mean, that was the great thing about the Nintendo 64 was there were just so many A+ games, and even some of the not so great games were still fun to play. So I think personally the three that come to mind when I think of the Nintendo 64 right off the bat is Harvest Moon 64, Perfect Dark, and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Now I know this is by no means my top 3 games. These are just kind of the ones that kind of resonated with me as a kid. For most people, a Zelda game's not too far off on their top games, and for most people who had a Nintendo 64, Perfect Dark was kind of another staple classic. But I know for a lot of people, at least those who aren't super into the video game world and things like that, Harvest Moon kind of is off the radar, and probably for good reason. It is for lack of a better term, it is a kind of a loose, gamey farm simulator. Something to more recent times would be Stardew Valley, which I think is a great spiritual successor to the Harvest Moon franchise. But there aren't a lot in this genre, and for me, there's always been a little spot in my heart for kind of micromanaging games like Roller Coaster Tycoon and SimCity and things like that. But this game took the kind of your slice of life style video game where there's not this kind of big overarching plot, but there's just a lot of little things that happen throughout the game that kind of make for an entire experience. You see this a lot in anime specifically, but Harvest Moon is a farming simulator. You start off at your grandfather's kind of hand-me-down farm, and the whole point is to just kind of learn the mechanics and figure out what you're supposed to do, because they kind of just drop you into the world with a couple bags of seed, the tools that you need to go and collect wood and stone for various other reasons, and then your garden hoe to make the land ready for seeds, and then the seeds, and then a watering can so you can water them every day. And there's just something cool about going through these games and just kind of figuring out what's going on. So when I started Harvest Moon 64, I was super young, but I just remember the first time going through a game and my first playthrough of it. So the game technically doesn't end, but because it was the N64 and the game had like a limited storage space back in the day, once you hit about year 3, the kind of campaign or the main story is over, but you could keep going. However, I think once you get to about year 5, the game starts to kind of crash and glitch out because it doesn't have enough memory to save all of the information that's being provided. So most games, at least for me, were about 3 years because I knew if I played it any longer than that, I would just, be fighting to get to the next day. And it's cool because they just drop you into this game and there's like tons of stuff to do, and like kind of one of the big things about the game was the social interaction. So like everyone in town had their own unique personality, and you talk to them, and you could give them gifts, and you could give each villager, which I believe there was upwards to probably like high teens, low 20s villagers, and all of them had certain likes and dislikes. So like, someone in town might enjoy a certain crop, while another one might enjoy milk, which you find out eventually that, you can buy cows so that you can milk said cows and then give that, either sell that milk or give it to the person in town. And so the idea behind that was, there were certain, and you played a boy, and so this game's a little, in my personal opinion, it's a little outdated because you're a boy, and one of the things you could do is marry one of the potential bachelorettes. Now, like I said, this game's a little dated in terms of its kind of marriage system compared to today with games like Mass Effect, where you could have homosexual relationships, guy, girl, whatever. You could have those relationships. This game was, you were a dude, and it kind of followed a very Catholic, you're a dude and you have to marry a woman, and that was that. So the idea was that there were, I think, 5 or 6 different like marriage candidates, so girls that would go through these scenes and like you more, and then you could also get other villagers to get married with other people. And so, long story short, this game had a lot of like inner working mechanics that they didn't teach you, and you just kind of had to learn on your own. And by the time, I played this game for probably like 4 or 5 years, just like on and off. There were some summers where I would just spend all day playing it, and if I ever got kicked out to go outside, I would just think about Harvest Moon and then come back and play it. So yeah, this game, super fun, doesn't really kind of hold up to today's standards, but if that sounds like a cool idea, but you're looking for something a little more modern, definitely check out Stardew Valley. It's basically the same premise. It's done in a kind of 16-bit style that seems to be very popular with indie developers, but it's out on the PC, it's out on the Switch. With the PC, there's like a lot of modding and cool stuff, and that game is, much like Harvest Moon in the sense that like you kind of get dropped in, you got to learn how to play the game, and then there's all these cool things that you learn. So, and the reason I bring up Harvest Moon and the reason I talk about it so much is like every now and then I just, get a song stuck in my head from that game, or I remember a particular part in the game, which seems really weird, but it's just, it was one of those I think it was the first time in my gaming career where a game didn't have to be this kind of legendary story where you were, some person and you had to go fight this monster so that you could go save the people of the village, and it just was very eye-opening to see that there were more games out there that weren't so linear in its story. Oh, and this game, I would say you create the story. I think that's what's so cool about it is not only is it a non-linear story, but you make up the story. Why do you? They don't make up some kind of story as to why you go on the farm or why you talk to the people you do. You just kind of go like, oh, well, this is kind of, at first it was like, oh, this is me. Like, this girl's really nice. I'll talk to her and I'll give her gifts because I think she's cute, and, so on and so forth. So it was the first time where a video game kind of let you, in a creative way, kind of make your own story. And I thought that was super cool as a kid. And then that led me to, games like Roller Coaster Tycoon, Sim City. I dabbled a little bit in The Sims, etc., etc. So from there, in my youth, Perfect Dark, probably one of my favorite multiplayer games from the N64 era. This and Time Splitters 2 for the GameCube. Now, to give you some background on my retro gaming, I was definitely a Nintendo kid. I had a Super Nintendo. I had a Genesis for a little bit. I had a Nintendo 64, and then kind of so on and so forth. And only until I was in like kind of later in high school, where I was starting to make my own money or save money, that I could actually own multiple consoles. So like one of the things growing up was that I was only allowed to have one console because we didn't have a whole lot of space, and video games, they took up a ton of space. So yeah, that was one of those things. So for me, Nintendo really just kind of, I think part of it was I didn't get a PlayStation because there was really, I was one of those I guess it's unfortunate, but I wasn't allowed to play games that were kind of out of my ESRB rating system. So, like, if a game was mature, I couldn't play it until I was 18. So, for me, the Nintendo just seemed like the obvious choice because PlayStation was definitely designed and geared towards a more mature audience, which at that time I was not. So, from there, we do Perfect Dark, which was probably the only, and I think this one kind of slipped through. Sorry, Mom. But this game was, if you played GoldenEye, it's GoldenEye in the future with spies and aliens and all that kind of stuff. And what was really cool about Perfect Dark was it had this interesting story. The main protagonist was this badass female spy, Joanna Dark, and just like James Bond, except on the other side of the spectrum, she would go in, sneak into places, kick some ass, do all this stuff, and I besides like Metroid, this was again one of those games, one of the very first times, at least in my childhood, where I was like, whoa. Like, there's so much more to video games than just, like, that big buff dude, going around doing dude stuff. Like, and granted, that was the time. Video games were very male-centric. Lots of story plots involved, fantasy male heroes going to save some princess. Or, I mean, look at Mario 64, or just any Mario. Most of the time, it is Mario saving a princess from a giant turtle monster. So, video game, and I guess this is a statement on the video game industry. Like, it was very male-centric, and so I understand why people get, they get heated about, inclusion of, female character, strong female leads, or different orientations. Because not only was it at the time a very male-centric, but it was definitely a straight male-centric hobby, which I didn't even realize until I was a lot older, when I started seeing people complain about it, and then I kind of dug deeper in myself to realize, like, holy crap, like, yeah, we definitely need, all sides of that spectrum. It can't just be, the big, like I said, the big buff dude going around saving princesses. That's no fun. So we have Perfect Dark, which is this badass spy, and she goes around, and she's kind of going into this big conspiracy where you find out that aliens or these two alien races are fighting each other, and somehow the humans get involved. And it's been a long time since I played it, but I think the cool part was, like, you end up buddying with the kind of standard gray aliens with, like, the big oval heads and the big black eyes, and you kind of fought these almost like kind of animalistic super monsters, big scary dudes. And I think the reason that Perfect Dark stuck with me after the fact, like, besides the fact that it was just kind of a really cool story, I was so into, like, spies and all that cool shit. Like, I love Joanna Dark. She was super cool. She just seemed like a badass. And I think the part that kept me playing was the fact that you could create your own kind of custom games within, like, the multiplayer. So you could do a lot of cool stuff with the fighting. So, like, I know in GoldenEye they had modes like mines and slappers only and stuff like that. And maybe they had a little more, maybe it was more customizable, but I don't remember being able to do that. But in Perfect Dark, you could select the people you were playing, and which was a vast variety of characters from the entire game, because there was, not only did you have the main characters, but you had the main villains, and then you had kind of just like almost generic people, so you could kind of set up these cool little missions. Like I used to do this one where it was like the allied aliens, and then like the people, like the main people versus the bad guys, who were like this other kind of spy organization and something else. And I would give each side different weapons. Sometimes I would do silly modes. Like there was this one grenade that you could throw at people, and it would disorient them terribly and would do very little damage. And I used to jack that item up to 1,000,000. Everyone had that item and like could find it anywhere. And I would put it on a map that was dimly lit, and it would just be this absolute clusterfuck of like, just kind of, it was basically like drunk vision, and fighting a bunch of people with this thing that barely did any damage, and the more you hit them with it, the more drunk they were. So like that was really fun. And Perfect Dark, along with a game that would later come out for the GameCube called Time Splitters 2, they were just like really fun multiplayer games, and there was so much customization that like you could play it forever and not feel like you've just done the same thing over and over again. And then the final game, and for some people, this is probably really shocking, but when I think of the N64, I don't actually think of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is kind of the staple, like, this is the best game ever. And for me, it was all about Majora's Mask. It was so... The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask is the sequel, or not I guess it would be a sequel in the sense that it was the same engine, and they made another Zelda game they made the second game in order to get a little more on that same engine that they had just built, and they had these, and what was different about this game is so in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, there is considered two different timelines. There's when your main character is a child, and then when your main character is an adult. And the majority of the end game is done in the adult, but Majora's Mask takes place after the events of Ocarina of Time, as he was a kid. And in a nutshell, it's this adventure game where you get transported to a strange land, and you have to go through 4 dungeons, much like you do in any Zelda game. You explore, you find dungeons, you go into the dungeons, you collect things so you can fight the boss. You fight the boss, and at the end, after you've completed that about 4 times in different variations in different settings, you go to some kind of final boss and like a final dungeon, and then the game ends. But what was really cool about this game, and this kind of got me, I think this game specifically got me thinking about the way games work, and this kind of made me a little, I started caring more about mechanics in video games after this game, because it was so cool. In Majora's Mask, the core mechanic is that when you start, in 3 days, the game's over. The moon comes hurtling towards the earth, and everything gets destroyed. And so quickly you have to figure out in those first 3 days, like, oh shit, what am I going to do? And then you eventually get this mechanic that allows you to travel through those 3 days. And so the rest of the game is kind of in this 3-day cycle. And what's cool is that every single character has basically their own unique cycles through those 3 days, which ends up being one of the core mechanics to acquire the collectible masks that you get in the game. So that's the big thing. The reason all this nonsense is happening is because there's this evil mask that contained the spirit of a demon, and then some forest creature picked it up, started using it, and progressively became more evil and worse. And so your job is to get this mask, which is called Majora's Mask. And one of the cool collectible side quests is that there were something like 20 plus masks in the game, and some of those masks you needed in order to progress through the story, but a lot of them were just kind of collectibles. You didn't necessarily need them to complete the game, but they all had these certain mechanics, and a lot of them took a while to get. So one of the masks that I'm thinking of specifically, you have to go through the life of this couple that is trying to, basically their marriage is coming, but something's awry, and then you go, and through the days, the first day, they're both kind of happy, and then you see them kind of walking around trying to get the wedding together. Then something bad happens on the second day. I'm trying to avoid spoilers, and partially because it's been a while since I've played the remake, so I might get some of this information not correct. Sorry, everybody. But, so yeah, everyone had a 3-day cycle, and each day was a little different. They might have some things that are the same, but it felt real. It felt like these people were actually alive, where a lot of games, when you start playing them, especially older games, where, a certain NPC or somebody in town only has, one line of dialogue, and if you accidentally, if you're trying to get something to work and you have to talk to them, and they kept saying, hello there, welcome to the village, hello there, welcome to the village, hello there, you start to see where the cardboard cutout comes out. And Majora's Mask was so unique because, everyone had a cycle, so people would walk around town, guards would change posts and things like that, and it felt so alive, where up until this point a lot of games didn't feel alive until you got into some cutscene or you progressed the story, and it was super cool, and it got me to think about, and that's why I get very kind of analytical, and sometimes I dive almost too deep into the way mechanics work and how those mechanics make the game for better or for worse, depending on the game. And yeah, that was kind of those would be kind of the highlights, or the things that I remember very vividly, and kind of how they shaped the way I thought about video games. But, I didn't stop from there. I eventually did get a PlayStation 2 and played Final Fantasy 7 and a lot of the older games that I never got a chance to with the original PlayStation. I would fall in love with the GameCube. I'm a little biased. I am a Nintendo fanboy. I feel like most Nintendo games, especially when it's developed by Nintendo themselves, are smooth, they're polished, they're great, they're all sorts of fun. They're fun. They're just fun. And I think that is important in a video game. At least one that I'll play anyways. I know that there are certain arguments that some game, that this is a very debated topic. So for me personally, when I'm playing games, if a game is fun, if I'm enjoying it, then it's doing a pretty good job, at least for me. So, I know this is going to be a shorter episode, so I'm going to kind of do the midsection, middle section. So, guys, if you want to start asking us questions, this whole episode kind of came from 2 questions that have been asked by one of our top listeners, John. Thank you, John. Follow us on Twitter at fandomr_podcast. That's our Twitter handle. If you want to ask us questions, feel free to send us an email at fanroulettepodcast@gmail.com. This will definitely help us kind of gauge where the conversation should be going. If you feel like we don't talk enough about the things that you want to talk about, we would like to hear from you. We'd like to know what people want to hear on any given day. So yeah, please follow us on get at us at one of those social medias. We're still working on Facebook, but should be coming along soon. If you're looking for an easy to acquire link, if you want to share us with some of your friends, maybe you're new to podcasting and you want to tell people about us, we'd really appreciate it. You can send them our website at www.fandomroulette.com. That's where all the shows will be posted. If there's any kind of new information coming out, that'll be on there as well. And we're also on iTunes and SoundCloud. So if you're on iTunes, feel free to, rate us, etc. We would greatly appreciate that. And yeah, that's more or less the midsection. I try to keep that as quick as possible. So boo-doo-boop, end of the middle section. So I had another question come up from one of our listeners, which I will get to. And if time, or if I haven't gone over time or feel like I can talk a little more, I'm still kind of weaving in and out of being ill at the moment. But yeah, I'm going to kind of jump right into role-playing games. It's kind of my second big thing that I'm known for here. I've kind of been my circle of friends dungeon master for quite some time. I run about 3 different groups at any given time. So yeah, I feel like my experience is at least worth talking about, or worth noting to give people an idea of where I'm coming from. So yeah, I DM a lot. I am rarely the player, and oftentimes when I'm getting and this kind of goes into the question is what does my dungeon master prep look like? I know I've talked about it before. You should come prepared, depending on the session, or at least come prepared to improvise is another one that I do. But I do often come prepared, and so I kind of want to a little bit of unveiling the situation, telling people how I prep for a session, because I know there can be a lot. I know personally one of the big things that kind of made me nervous when I first started was players doing things that I was not prepared for. That was kind of one of the big ones, and it scared me almost to the point where I wasn't going to do it. But then I just kind of jumped in and kind of, figured it out for myself. And so in order to avoid, especially if you're dungeon mastering for people that might have been in this hobby, they've been doing it for a while, and I know personally I don't like to be embarrassed. So if you feel the same way, I hope that this helps. So my preparation kind of comes in twofold, because I play very different games, so I prep very differently for those games. Now, I have a kind of flavor of the week Thieves Guild that I run. We call them the Rowdy Rough Boys. They're the ones that I cannot prepare for at any given time. They will shock me to no end at any given moment. So this is where, and I think this helps for flavor of the week style games where maybe it's a one shot, maybe you're not sure how these people are going to be playing with you the next session. Maybe you can't hold the same 5 people to come every week. I often prep a area and usually a couple different hooks. So what is a hook? A hook is something to get the players interested in your world. For my Thieves Guild, one of their big notions is they want to be the best Thieves Guild in town, and what better way to do that than stomp out the competition? So oftentimes I will prep, and they'll be simple. Like, I usually make a sentence about what this is, like, oh, the local brothel gang or whatever wants to kind of get in on the Rowdy Rough Boys territory. Like, that's it. I just make a sentence and then go from there. I try not to get too detailed. I like to keep the narrative a little open so that the players can tackle the situation as they will. But I usually give them a problem, and you can sum it up in a sentence. There's a gang. They're in on your territory. What do you do? And so oftentimes I ask leading questions, things like, well, how would you solve this situation? And kind of let them work through it, and then kind of use, and it's also a good note to know where you're playing. So in my case, I have a homebrew setting. They're in a town called Redport, and they are, it's a very big town, lots of different districts, things like that. My own style of D&D. And that's not to say you can't use other stuff. Like, I know there are tons of people who are, make their own campaigns going through Waterdeep or the Lost Coast and stuff like that. If you're going to use material, your DM prep is probably going to look more like reading up on that area and figuring out who the key players are, who runs the place, who what guilds exist, more hooks, things that can get players interested. So for my Thieves Guild, they want to stop off the competition, so most of my hooks tend to be these other gangs pushing back on their success, because they've been pretty alarmingly successful in this campaign. I start with the problem. Usually I try to figure out, and this is where Xanathar's Guide to Everything really helps me out. Sometimes I'll make tables, or I'll use tables to generate encounters. So for me, I'll just go into Xanathar's Guide, and there's a helpful little section with, RPG encounters. And not all of them are monsters. Some of them are, different NPCs, or you can take those NPC monsters and turn them into non-combat situations. So, for instance, they want to wrestle around with one of the local gangs, and so I roll on this table. And maybe it is just combat. Maybe you want to start off with like a cool battle, and some bandits come in, and your party has to fight through them and beat them up so that they can interrogate one of them to find where the missing stash is or whatever. A lot of my DM prep is kind of being open and having some tools to, for a lack of a better term, create a seamless narrative without necessarily putting all this time and effort into, okay, well, they're going to fight this guy and then they're going to do this. Like, because and one of the pitfalls of DM prep, never assume your character or the people who are playing with you are going to do the thing you want them to do, because 9 times out of 10, they will shock and awe you. And it's true. I think every session I have played thus far with the Rowdy Rough Boys, they have done something that I did not prepare for and kind of left me almost speechless. So run with it. If they want to do something that's completely off base, yeah, work on the fly. That's one of the big things I do for them. Is I used to have just kind of random encounter tables. I would generate, mild, from easy to hard encounters that I would roll on, and then whatever I rolled, that's what they would encounter. And there's stuff like that in Xanathar's Guide. I cannot praise Xanathar's Guide enough. It is probably my favorite D&D book, like, just period. And it's got so many great tables in it for dungeon masters to get help. So if improvising's not your thing, but you still want to run a very fluid game, Xanathar's Guide, or just looking online, there's I'm sure there are tons of 5th edition D&D tables for random encounters and things like that. So that's my one session. That's my flavor of the week. I try to keep it loose and not overly prepare. I usually just create some fun NPCs, and I have used some of my silly NPCs of the week on my players, and they've all been pretty fun. And yeah, so when it comes to just very light role-playing game, it's all about just being fluid. And if you are unfamiliar with how that works, just getting random tables and just kind of working with it, letting the players move the narrative at times. Like if you're lost, ask them what they would do. Oftentimes, if I need to stall or I'm confused, I just ask the simple question, well, what would you do? And sometimes that will kind of, they'll feed off of that and give you like, oh, well, I assume there's got to be this kind of guy. I'm looking for that guy. And you're like, oh, yeah, of course there's that guy. Yes, definitely plot hook MacGuffin man's over there. Yeah, he's right over there. And honestly, ever since I went to this method of running their game, it had been smooth sailing. I've never had a session where I felt like it dragged or didn't work out in the way that I liked. So yeah, not all of your games are going to be kind of flavor of the week. So for most people, you're going to want to run an adventure. I think there are at least 5 adventures that you can run, most of them ranging from 1 to 10. I don't think there are many high-level campaigns, just because typically I think the statistic is that a campaign never gets past level 10 unless it's designed that way. So yeah, if you're running a book, or hell, you want to write your own adventure, you want to do your own thing, there's a little more prep work for that. If you're running a book, the usual thing I do is I will read the first couple of chapters before that session. Usually I read the book first before the adventure. I mean, you've got plenty of time. They're waiting on you. And then once I've read through it once, I usually keep the first couple of chapters, or whatever chapter we're on, like, I'll tend to reread that. and try to memorize it, or not, memorize isn't the right word, but keep it familiar. Maybe put tabs in your book like, oh, this is an important page that I need, and I'm never going to remember this NPC stat block, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have that. If you're not running a pre-made book, because oftentimes the pre-made books, they do a pretty decent job at being like, this is the encounter, these are the creatures they'll fight, they're on this page in the monster manual. Like, they do a lot of the footwork for you. So when it, and one of my games is an adventure that I created on my own. It's not super great or anything. I don't want to make it seem like it's more than it is, but I did make it in my own homebrew setting, and so I kind of have to set the pace for this adventure. And in my personal opinion, the reason why I think this is such a great idea or a great thing to do is if it's your own world and it's your own adventure, like, you can do whatever you want. Say the party's in the tavern and you want to spice it up by throwing in some rough thugs who mistake them for somebody else. Like, that's a thing you can do. It's your universe, it's your game. If you've got a group of bandits, maybe they're the wet bandits and they go around and steal people's stuff and they steal the party stuff. Like, hell yeah, do what you want. It's your campaign. You do you. And prepping for that can be a bit. It's definitely longer. It takes a lot of time. In fact, this week I spent a ton of time prepping for the next session's dungeon that the players are going to be in. And so if you have the Dungeon Master's Guide, it gives you a lot of great tools to kind of set up your own encounters, set up your own custom enemies. Oftentimes, I just like to reskin enemies from the monster manual. Like, if I feel like they fit the, these aren't quite bandits, but they're something like bandits, then I'll just use the bandit tab or the bandit stat block and just kind of go from there. When prepping for a particular session, I usually prep the location they're going to be in and know it pretty well. So in this case, for my players, they are in a district in one of the many cities in my universe. It's primarily dwarven. They live like on the side of a mountain, and they're going into a mausoleum of one of the kind of big noted families of this kind of empire. And so I needed to know the place, and mine is it's a giant vineyard with a big giant house at the end of it, kind of, one of those like crazy millionaire houses or whatever. And then this mausoleum, I had to build the place. I had to figure out what was going on. So location, if you're starting new, the location can be anything. It could be, out on the roads going to the next town. It could be at a tavern. It could be, right after the royal crowning of Sir Richard of, Pendleton. It could be whatever you want. So just knowing that location well enough to, answer questions like, oh, well, what does this place look like? Who are the people around? Having some NPCs written down, and oftentimes what I think are great NPCs is usually I give them a name and a gender and a race from the player's handbook, and then I give them kind of goals or aspirations, like what are they doing? Sometimes I'll give them a profession. Maybe they're a shopkeep and they're looking to, ask the players for help because one of their shipments has gone missing. Or maybe there's a seedy local guard who trades information for booze money or, what have you. Usually what I do is a name, and oftentimes I will just have a random, group of names on a list that I'll keep with me. So I guess that's how I prepare for sessions. Is I'll have a big list of randomly generated names, and if I ever run into a situation where I didn't plan for a character, I can just point to that list and be like, oh, well, that nobleman that you passed that scoffed at you, this is Sir Archwell de Dukington of the Blaggerton family. And then they go, oh, okay, yeah, no, that's cool. And so, having a name, a list of the names, having a familiar understanding of the location, understanding and I feel like this is kind of like the first and foremost, but kind of slipped my mind. Having a pretty firm grasp of the rules, or at least enough of the rules so that you can pretty much get through a session. Oftentimes, personally, I don't know much about the characters' stats and things like that. Like, I don't know anything about the spells. I oftentimes ask the players to just kind of read aloud to me what they're casting so that I can get a familiar. And, over time, your first session, as long as you have some cool names, some cool locations, NPCs that the players will run into, and just a general notion of where you want them to go, you should be okay. And that's pretty much what I prep. And it changes from week to week. Like, if you want it to be like a cool classic dungeon crawl, well, you're going to need a dungeon. And there's a really good part right at the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide that lets you basically roll up your dungeon. And I always enjoy that because I think it offers me some new insight on, what this dungeon's going to be. They give you stuff as mundane as the type of door that's ahead to how wide the passageways are. Like, is this like a wide passage for giants? Or is this something little for, halflings and gnomes? There's a great section at the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide that helps you build dungeons, if that's what you're looking for. Monster manual, and there's an awesome website called Kobold Fight Club that I often use to stat the fights. And what's cool about this site is you can plug in, like, I have 5 players who are level 4 and they're going to fight 16 bandits. It'll auto-calculate the experience for me, which will give me an idea of how difficult that encounter is. And I often have that site pulled up just so that I can basically play around with it, make sure that combat encounters aren't, ludicrously hard for no reason, or make sure that they're not just like, they fought a rat and it was the most boring thing that they could have done. So, yeah, I'm a little all over the place, but in a nutshell, with DM prep, if I were to boil it down to its basics, understand the rules, know the location or the locations that players might go to, and then understand or have some NPCs that can either progress or halt or interfere with the story. I think those big 3 will kind of get you through it. And once you start playing, you'll start to realize, like, oh yeah, like, this is cool, but I also want to do this. And so eventually I started to, homebrew my own rules and, like, kind of extra stuff and how I wanted to make NPCs, because I realized that I wanted them to have motivation, but I also wanted them to have flaws that could be exploited if needed, etc., etc. So yeah, that's kind of my DM prep. I know it's a little all over the place, but those top 3 are the most important, and they're always in every one of my sessions. And then from there, I kind of do it differently based on what people are looking for. So yeah, that's more or less it. Thank you so much, guys, for coming and listening. I know this is these are a little shorter, but I feel pretty comfortable and knowledgeable about gaming, and especially with role-playing now that I've been kind of, being a dungeon master for so long. And more or less, this is kind of like, if you like this episode and you want to learn more about me, you want to learn more about Joe, you want to learn, just more about the hobbies in general. I know I didn't get to a couple of the other things I wanted to talk about, but if you want to hear us talk about something in particular, please reach out. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to talk about your stuff. Again, one of our dedicated listeners gave me these questions that kind of spawned this episode. So again, thank you guys so much. And as per usual, stay super nerdy.